If I step forward, I can actually see there are people out there. That's a good thing. Well, thank you all for coming to this talk. This is the 5th Buzzwords I've been to, and I am a great fan. Let's see if I can actually aim 2 directions at once here and get it to progress. No. Okay, it's working. Okay, I'll just do it from here. I don't know why this is. One more try. All right. So I am a consultant. I work for MapR Technologies in San Jose. I'm pretty good at some things, but apparently not very good at getting the slide clicker to work. I'm an O'Reilly author and also a committer on the Apache Drill and Apache Mahout projects. I'll repeat this contact information at the end. So today I want to talk to you about the ways that people come to knowledge and innovation, some things that have worked well, some things that have not worked as well, and give you a chance to think about how the lessons you learn from what other people have done may play out on what you're trying to do. But if you were to take home one piece of advice from me today, it's this first one. It sounds like nothing, but it's a huge thing. We're all very busy people. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of details around in whatever we're doing. But you have to actually make formally time for yourself, quiet time to get away from everything, to really think. And part of what I recommend that you think about are what are the key ideas, the key concepts in whatever you're trying to do. And you may think you know what they are, but when you really think about them, it may surprise you. If you can really identify that, it helps you communicate your work to other people. But more importantly, it gives you the foundation for thinking in which you can come up with new ideas. And that's a real foundation for innovation. So that's my first bit of advice. And let's look at how innovation has worked in a big data, an open source project. All of you are working in this field at a very exciting time. People are using data in completely new ways, learning to use data at scale. They're able to ask questions that really nobody's tried to ask before. It's a very exciting time for you to work in this. And so let's look at a project that used enormous data and had a lot of success. This is a really big project, open source, crowdsourced. It also involved data-driven decisions that actually saved people's lives and made some people very wealthy. And the most surprising thing about it is that all this took place in the 19th century. So there was a sailor in the US Navy. His name was Matthew Morey. When he was a fairly young man, he injured his leg. He could no longer go to sea. The Navy gave him a desk job. And surprisingly, that's when the real adventure in his life began, because he was a very innovative thinker. He discovered that there were boxes and boxes of old books, old captain's logs. Well, the captains weren't old, but the books were. So when people would go to sea, the captain would take measurements. These were actually time series data. They'd measure maybe the temperature, air temperature, water temperature, speed of the winds, whatever, what they had for breakfast, and if there was enough rum. So it wasn't very consistent data. And they would turn in these books at the end of the trip. Somebody would throw it in a box, and they'd forget it. So what Morey realized is there were hundreds and hundreds of these, maybe thousands, I don't know. Each log had very little value. But he realized if he painstakingly, with his team, extracted by hand all of the data that was valuable and aggregated that data, you had a really tremendously valuable resource. So they produced these winds and currents charts that had enormously valuable navigational information for shipping routes all around the world. And when they first published this, the impact of it was basically nothing, because people didn't appreciate the value of that data. So it is important to learn to communicate what you do. If you're working on an open source project, you build it. You also need to build a user community and help people understand why that tool may be useful to them. What happened here is that one ship captain, his name was Captain Jackson. He was doing a sail down from, on the coast of the Americas, down from Baltimore to Rio de Janeiro and back. He used one of these charts. He shaved off 17 days on the way down and 18 on the way back. When you come into port 30 days early, other people notice. They're very competitive. Now everybody wanted one of the charts. Here's where Morey was really smart. He wanted better data. So he made a uniform template, and in order to get one of his charts, somebody had to go collect better data in a uniform way, turn in the template, and they would get a chart. It had a huge impact on navigation. So the lessons that you can learn from this, the main one I want you to take away is this idea of innovation. If you look past the normal things that you think about, you may discover a big idea. And also, a lesson that you all know already is that there can be huge value in an aggregate of data that smaller data sets don't have on their own. Now, I just came from Strata in London, and I saw this big poster up from Sherlock Holmes, this quote, it's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. I agree with that. I also want to point out there's some pretty big mistakes you can make after you have data as well, if you don't do it right. So the next part of my talk is called Undiscovering the Cure for Scurvy. How many people in here have heard of scurvy? Yes? A lot? A few people raise their hands. Well, scurvy is a fairly horrible disease. It's caused by a scarcity, a lack of vitamin C. Vitamin C is actually ascorbic acid. It's really a terrible disease, but it can easily be prevented or cured by eating fresh foods that have vitamin C, especially citrus, watercress, even meat to some extent if it's unprocessed meat. So we've known that for a long time, even from ancient time. People thought this might be true. But a British doctor named Lind in 1747 did some moderately controlled experiments and was able to actually show that it looked like fresh citrus really contributed to curing or preventing scurvy. He published this in a fairly famous document at the time. A lot of people heard about it. Now, it wasn't until much later, 1933, that people could actually isolate what it was in citrus fruit, vitamin C, ascorbic acid, that was a cure. But they knew that eating fresh citrus would take care of you. And certainly by 1799, the British Navy required sailors to have fresh lemon juice. This was a tremendous advantage to the British Navy because they could stay out at sea longer, they were healthier. This went on for years and years. It's part of how they really dominated the seas for a long time. So it was somewhat surprising that in 1911, a British doctor who was on a long polar expedition recorded in his journal that people were dying from scurvy, how sad it was that nobody had any idea how to cure or prevent it. What should we conclude from this is something happened. So you can read about this. There was an interesting blog that was based on this book called The Worst Journey in the World, talking about this Scots polar expedition. But basically, what had happened in between is in 1860, the British Navy made a change. And what they changed is they had been using lemons, mostly from Italy. That was expensive. They decided they could use limes. They thought it was the acidity that is what you wanted, and the limes are more acidic than lemons. They figured that would be better. And then they wanted to get limes from the West Indies. That was land that they control, and that was better for them. So they started using, and it's easier to use bottled lime juice than fresh juice or limes or lemons. So that was a change that they made. And why was that an issue? Is because it turns out that this bottled lime juice was ineffective against scurvy. But it also turns out nobody noticed. What should you conclude from that? Okay. So here's what was going on. It was this bizarre set of little decisions, each of which wasn't totally crazy at the time, but they weren't tested in a disciplined way. People didn't consider alternative explanations. So what happened is they moved from lemons to limes. That goes to 25% as much ascorbic acid, vitamin C. It also turns out that vitamin C is sensitive to air, to oxidation, exposure to heat, and exposure to copper. They made this in these big vats, heated the vats, they exposed it to air, and then piped it through copper. There wasn't much vitamin C in there to start with, and they put it in bottles. So by the time they bottled it, there really wasn't much of anything there. That was a mistake that they made in making that change. You would think right away, however, they would notice that people would get sick and die from scurvy. They didn't. So what else happened is, bad set of coincidences. They were actually doing something right. They let go of their old idea in response to new data, but they didn't do it in a careful and disciplined way. So this is just unfortunate that right about the same time, steamships speeded up travel. Sailing ships were more efficient, thanks to Maury's charts. And so ships didn't stay out at sea as long. And it turns out you only need a very small amount of vitamin C, and it takes a very long time to develop the symptoms. So people kept treating themselves with lime juice, thinking they were okay, And they weren't until they started taking these very long polar expeditions. And so at that point, another mistake was made, which is basically to think, something changed. Fine, they knew that. But they threw out the entire idea of citrus and kind of went back to square one. So the lesson to take away from that is when something changes, look for what changed and look for alternative explanation. Very quickly, I'll tell you, because I'm kind of not doing well on my timing here, but I'll tell you that there's a modern laboratory story. I'm actually not trained in the field of computing originally. I was a biochemist. I have a doctorate in biochemistry, and I did research in molecular biology. A friend of mine who was working as a technician in a lab called me one day, almost in tears. She was doing an absolutely standard procedure. She'd done it over and over, and suddenly one day it didn't work. That's surprising, but not that surprising. She did what you're supposed to do, which is repeat the procedure, and she did that many times, but it still failed. At this point, she repeated it more times and began to consider another career path. A better choice would have been for her to ask what changed. Well, she was asking what changed, but it didn't seem like anything had changed. She was doing the same way every time, and she's keeping very good records, so she knew she was doing it the same way. When it appears that nothing changed, but clearly something broke, what you need to do is to remember that physics works. Don't abandon that and look again and ask yourself what possibly could have changed. In this case, one of the reagents she was using was from a new lot, a new group of reagents, and it turned out that reagent was contaminated. So in fact, she wasn't doing anything different. Her starting material was different. It took her a long time to discover that. When things break, ask yourself what changed last. Hopefully you've taken good enough records that you can tell. Ask yourself what changed, when did it last work, and trust that there has to be something that's different and it has to make sense. So what does this have to do with you and the kind of world and the work that you do? I came up with this one example. Somebody does something, they've developed something, and the program is working fine, they go into production, and now it doesn't work. Have everybody heard anybody say, well, but it worked on my machine? So clearly what they need to do is ask themselves, what changed? What could possibly be different? And obviously there are a number of different things that might change in the environment. That's certainly a place to start. When things appear to break, you think you're doing the same thing you've done before, consider alternative explanations. Here's a quick story. As I said, I used to be a biochemist. I was on a plane going to a big biochemistry conference. A man sitting next to me worked for a company that made pet food. I worked in academic research. That was a very different world for me. So he's telling me stories about how they do biochemistry. They were making a new synthetic flavor for dog food. And he said one of the challenges is that you make it, but then is it better than the old flavor? Well, do dogs like it better? So here's how he did the test. He basically did A/B testing. They would take the old flavor, not old dog food, but the old flavor of dog food, put it in a bowl. They put the new flavor in a bowl, put the bowls down on the floor, open the door, and let a dog in. Basically, they ask a dog. Now, this wasn't a real big sample size, but they did repeat the test a number of times. And they just looked to see which flavor, which dog food did the dog prefer. And they did the test over and over, and greatly to their disappointment, the dog preferred the old food. So that, all right, the new flavor's no good. They went back, tried it again, synthesized a new flavor, do the same sort of test again. Will the dog prefer the old food or the new food? Again, they let the dog in. Very disappointing. The dog goes to the old food. They start thinking maybe the food flavor they had originally is as good as you can do, until it finally occurred to somebody to reverse the position of the bowls. And it turns out, every single time the dog went to the bowl on the left. So basically, they thought that they were testing the dog's preferences for flavor. They were testing the dog's preferences for the position of the bowls. Now, last year at Hadoop Summit in San Jose, my co-author Ted Dunning and I were doing a book signing for 2 titles that we've done in a machine learning series, one on recommendation and one on anomaly detection. And we let people, when they came up to get a book, choose which one they wanted. And I was very surprised to see that most people were choosing the one on recommendation. And it mainly surprised me because we happen to have a lot of people there who work for telecoms or for banks. I would have thought they'd be interested in the one on anomaly detection, until I suddenly remembered, and I leaned over and whispered dog food to Ted, and we took the stacks and we reversed them. And we discovered that data scientists prefer the books on the right. So when you're doing testing, when you're doing A/B testing or any kind of testing, do your testing, do it carefully, keep good records, but also make sure that the thing that you're testing is what you think you're testing. It's not always true. Consider alternative explanations. How does this feed into the world that you live in? Well, I'll take one example, and this is actually, again, this really happens. This story I heard from Ted Dunning a long time ago. He was building a recommendation engine for an online video streaming service, and he built the model, and when they first used as input data for the models, clicks, basically, here's a title, how many people would click on a particular movie, the recommender wasn't working well, and you start trying to tweak the algorithm or whatever, it's just very frustrating. But then he had the idea to not use that, and instead to use who views the first 30 seconds of a video. Suddenly the recommender worked really, really well. And so this is like the dog food case. In the first case, you're really testing how well people like the title of the movie, not whether they actually like that video. In the second case, you're actually testing their preference for the videos. So it's one of those cases where you're not testing what you think you're testing. Another one, if any of you have done modeling, you know the danger of having a target leak. This was one where there was a classifier built for news groups, and in order to do testing, they built this, they tried it out, and it worked really well. In order to do the testing, basically wanted to separate training data from your evaluation data, so they just took the single data set and took every other article, even number of articles for training, odd number for testing, and it turned out it worked. I mean, that's a good logical way to build a kind of matched, training and data and evaluation set. So it worked really well, and that's good news, except it worked really, really, really well. And so it really worked too well to be true. So you want to do a little alternative testing and say, well, that's great, but maybe not so great. It turns out many of the articles were articles that were basically repeated and had a slight modification or correction. And so when you separate them this way, you have too much overlap. One way to test that out was to actually separate them in terms of earlier and later articles, and at that point, the classifier collapsed. If it's too good to be true, it's probably not true. Consider alternative explanations. A quick moment here, I won't go into the whole story because running out of time, but anybody in here who studied chemistry, French chemist Lavoisier, we go back to the 18th century, he made some astounding discoveries about what happens when combustion happens. And he did this really by taking very careful measurements of the weight of the reagents and the products in these processes. But he did it in sealed containers, so he was weighing the solids and the gases, and then testing what happened. And from this, he drew an interesting set of conclusions. He was able to figure out that this mysterious substance called phlogiston, that people thought was in a substance and went away when the substance was heated, in fact didn't exist. He was able to get data that supported an idea that was already there, which is the conservation of matter, and along the way he actually discovered and named oxygen. I put this in to remind myself, to remind you, that careful measurements, monitoring, metrics, they may not sound super exciting, but they're really powerful techniques. If you do them well, you do them often, you keep really good records, and then you take time to step back and think about what they're telling you, you can learn a lot from that. Now, lately I think and talk a lot about streaming data. I feel like that's, the most surprising thing about my talk today is it wasn't about Flink and it wasn't about Kafka, which makes it unusual. So, of course, I have to talk about streaming data a little. Ted and I just finished another book called Streaming Architecture. And one of the things that we talk about is that if you use a messaging system that has the right kinds of capabilities, which, by the way, we think Apache Kafka is a really good one. Oops, now I'm back to Kafka. And MapR has a new messaging system that's actually built into its platform. It uses the Kafka API, but it goes a little beyond what Kafka does. But we think both of those are a great way to approach these kinds of architecture. But what happens is you basically have decoupled the producers and the consumers. And part of why that's important, the message is delivered, it can be used right away. It doesn't have to be used right away. Consumer can be offline, online. It means you can add consumers. And as you add consumers to consume that same streaming data, here I have it's an odd kind of reverse way of drawing a piece as a piece of a larger diagram, because this is out of the book. But these cylinders are actually looking at places where you use Kafka or MapR streams. Those are the messaging, the queues. And this was, again, from a video example. The thumbnail extractor is a service that's running. But besides just the uploads and the output, the thumbs, you can have various checkpoints, exceptions. You can do a lot of monitoring and a lot of metrics. it's very easy to add in those new consumers, and by doing that, you don't interrupt what's happening with the other consumers that are already running. That means it's easier to have metrics at more stages of what you do. It means you can have more fine-grained monitoring and metrics. Very, very powerful thing to do, and a shift in how people are working. So we think that's going to, help a lot with people making discoveries about how their systems are working. Metrics, metrics, metrics. Okay. This isn't quite about measuring, but it's another good lesson in this, and this is also a real-world example. A friend who was head of security for a bank did a kind of unusual thing, but he saved the headers for all website requests. He wasn't looking for any particular thing. He just wanted to save that data in case it was important, and he saved it for long periods of time. It turns out, as people tried to attack the website, get through the security barriers, he was able to detect anomalies in the pattern of the headers. They happen to be slightly different for the attackers. Now, this isn't something he could know a priori he needed to look for. He just saved as much data as he could to document what was happening in case he would need to look back at it. And in fact, he did, and he found this pattern. He was able to basically stop these attackers at the perimeter. So keeping a careful history of data paid off. Lavoisier, and in fact with the help of his wife, kept very careful records. That's part of how they could look back and make these discoveries. It's also a different sort of lesson here, and this is one of the things that's beginning to change in this modern world of big data, is that you may say things that you don't know at the time are going to be useful later. It's really helpful. It turns out in medical research this is important too. As people do retrospective studies, they've taken all these case studies from patients. Later, as they begin to understand what is going on, they say, I wish from 2 years ago we had recorded this information. You don't always know. So you don't just record the single thing you already know is going to be important. keep data. You don't know what will be important later. And it turns out this is, again, becoming increasingly easy to do. So back on the topic of these new tools for streaming data, if you have a messaging system that is able to do very low latency, it has very good performance, even with persistence. Older systems, you traded off performance to persistence. But with Kafka, with MapR streams, that's not true. You get both. So this means you not only deliver data for some sort of low latency or real-time or near real-time application, but you also have a replayable stream. That becomes a history, an auditable log. And that can be useful in a lot of different ways. You can configure in both of those systems, in Kafka and MapR streams, you can configure the time to live. So you can have these messages last almost not at all, get rid of them. You can have them basically set to infinity for time to live, and you've persisted the message. You can go back. You can save longer periods of messages, weeks, months, years, and actually be able to look back. And that becomes a very powerful tool for certain kinds of investigation. Now, I didn't realize that people hadn't thought of this, but we did a talk at a Flink meetup last week in London, and talking about this idea of keeping a long-term replayable log. A couple of people said, but you couldn't save that much data. I mean, that's not practical. You can just save short amount of data. And I realized if you are thinking in terms of Kafka, you're used to the idea that you have a topic, you have partitions of that topic for load balancing and so forth, but as of now, the topic lives on a machine. It's a little bit different. So we were thinking in terms of MapR streams. It's a little different in streams because the partitions in a topic are actually distributed all the way across the cluster. So it opens up this possibility of saving years of data, really not a problem. Not important for all applications, but in some applications it's useful. So let's do a quick summary of, I think, some of these lessons you can learn from old-time mistakes and some recent mistakes and some things people have done well. Take time to think. Again, it sounds trivial, but it has huge payoff. Find essential concepts. Essential concepts in what you do or what somebody else does is not the same as generalizations. A generalization doesn't have much meaning at all. You find the core of what really matters, and that helps you think about how systems work and how they can work in new ways. Things do break. When they do, ask when they work to last. Ask what changed. If it appears that nothing changed and they're broken, obviously something changed. Look back further. Consider alternative explanations. Make sure you're testing what you think you're testing. Consider alternative explanations. When it's too good to be true, I suggest that you consider alternative explanations. remember, if you measure more, keep metrics, you can really change the way you can fine-tune what you're doing, and you can change the way you can look back in history and see what happened, and that can be a very powerful tool. And also, you may want to save data that at the time you're not consciously aware exactly how you're going to use it. We've written a number of these short books. O'Reilly sells them. If you want to read just a PDF, MapR makes them available for free. If you go to the MapR site, you have to register. They might send you an email, but you'll be able to read the PDF. Our most recent book, Streaming Data, we have a few copies, and we'll do a little mini book signing and give some away tomorrow. I'm not sure exactly when. I have to look at the schedule. The co-author, Ted Dunning, is doing a talk today at 17:20, and I think he's going to say at the talk, when, but my guess is it will be in the morning, and I don't know the exact time. If you want to read the book online, this is actually available not as, it is as a PDF, but you can read it just as an active book online if you go to this link. A quick plug, please do support women in technology. But I also want to say, I love to see these groups where women are getting together and they're looking at the issues of how can we get more women into open source, how do we get more women in engineering. This is a topic I think should be of interest to people, not to women, not just groups of women talking, not just female speakers coming, not just female panels. I would like to see groups of men and women get together and talk about how to encourage more women in these fields. Thank you very, very much for having me here. And there's my contact information. Okay, on time.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Very nice.
So I didn't watch time. Is there time for a few questions?
Yeah, right. We have very much time for questions. Do you have questions to Ellen?
Okay, or I'll do this in the TED way. Do we have answers?
Yeah.
Okay. No, that doesn't work. All right. Thank you all very much for coming. I appreciate it.